The first strange thing about the North Bluff was not the cave. It was the chimney. There should not have been one. There was no house up there, no stove, no roof, no family foolish enough to spend a Wyoming winter inside a cut of limestone everyone in Mercy Gap called the Dead Pantry. And yet, on the morning the county took the Ainsworth cabin, Liddy found a thin black pipe already rising from the frozen ground 46 feet from the cave mouth. No smoke came out of it, only warmth. Not enough for anyone in town to notice from the road. Not enough to melt the snow around it into anything dramatic. Just a coin-sized ring of bare stone at its base. A dead man's clue. The kind of clue a town can step over for 10 years. Because it does not look like charity. It does not look like rescue. It does not look like love. It looks like a pipe in the wrong place. And that was why the men at the county table had been so pleased with themselves. They thought they had given a sick widow and her daughter a hole in the ground. They had. They just did not know what kind. The meeting was held in the back room of Harlan's freight office because Mercy Gap had never gotten around to building a proper town hall. County matters were handled where freight was weighed, debts were recorded, and men with clean cuffs decided what counted as necessary. Liddy stood beside her mother and kept both hands around the handle of her father's carpenter's level. She had carried it without thinking. Miriam Ainsworth had wanted to leave it behind with the rock samples and the broken lamp and the boots still waiting by the stove. But Liddy had taken it from the wall at dawn and hooked it through her belt. A level was not a weapon, but it had a way of making lies visible. At the long table sat 3 county men and Silas Crow, who owned the freight office, the mercantile, 2 wagons, 4 rental rooms, and most of the Mercy people mistook for generosity. He did not call Miriam Mrs. Ainsworth. He said, "Miriam, the county cannot carry your arrears through winter." Liddy heard the word carry and watched him enjoy it. Men like Crow loved words that made theft sound like lifting. Her mother answered carefully. The cough had trained her to do that. Each sentence cost breath. "We can pay after spring sowing." Crow looked toward the clerk, then back at Miriam. "The cabin sits on road reserve land. The surveyor has confirmed it. A mail stop is planned for that corner. You have until Friday to remove your belongings." Friday was 3 days away. Outside, wagon wheels ground frozen mud into powder. Inside, the stove ticked hot iron. Liddy could smell coffee, damp wool, and the ink on the paper the clerk was pretending not to look proud of. One of the commissioners cleared his throat. "We are not leaving you without shelter." That was when Liddy knew. Because decent news does not need a throat cleared before it. The clerk pushed a deed forward. 6 acres at the North Bluff. No charge. Recorded free and clear. Silas Crow folded his hands over his vest. The room made its careful face. The face people make when they have turned cruelty into paperwork and are waiting to be thanked for the neatness. Miriam looked at the deed, then at Liddy. Everyone in Mercy Gap knew the North Bluff. It rose beyond the last pasture, a pale limestone wall with wind-cut shelves and scrub cedar twisted flat against the rock. It had a cave dug into it from some abandoned lime operation before the town had a name. In summer, children dared one another to run inside and touch the back wall. In winter, no one went there because even from the trail, it seemed colder than the rest of the world. The old freighters called it the Dead Pantry because meat hung inside in August would not spoil for a week. A useful place for beef. Not for people. Miriam's fingers trembled. Liddy reached forward and took the deed before her mother had to. She said, "Thank you." Not because she meant it, because it ended the performance. As they stepped out into the white noon, someone behind the stacked flour sacks spoke without lifting his head. "Your pa set a line on that bluff." Liddy turned. Amos Vale sat on a broken crate beside the coal bin, his beard yellowed by tobacco smoke, his left leg stiff from the quarry blast that had ended his useful employment and most of his conversation. His hat shadowed his eyes. Crow said, "Amos, you are drunk." Amos smiled at the floor. "Usually." Then he looked at Liddy. "Not about that." Before she could cross the room, he pushed himself up and limped out through the loading door, leaving behind the smell of cold air and a sentence that would not sit still. "Your pa set a line on that bluff." Liddy had been 14 the day her father took her underground. Not into a mine, though Mercy Gap men called every hole a mine after enough whiskey. Jonas Ainsworth had worked on the railroad grade west of town, driving test cuts through limestone for a tunnel the company later abandoned when the money changed direction. He had brought her down one evening after the crew left. The passage sloped into the hill at a gentle angle. Timber ribs held back the stone. Water ticked somewhere in the dark. Liddy remembered the smell most clearly, wet lime and old iron. Her father had blown out the lamp. Darkness took the shape of a room around them. She had grabbed his sleeve. He said, "Easy, girl. Don't listen with fear. Listen with your skin." At first she heard nothing but her own pulse. Then she felt it, warmth. Not from a fire, not from breath, from the wall itself. A slow, stored warmth that seemed impossible because the entrance behind them was crusted with frost. Jonas placed her hand against the limestone. "Surface weather is a noisy thing," he said. "Sun up, sundown. Wind, snow, rain. Always changing its mind. But stone is older than weather. Down here, it remembers in months." She had not understood. He took a small brass level from his pocket and held it against the tunnel floor. "Everything that wants to kill you has a direction. Smoke wants up. Water wants down. Cold wants in. Heat wants out. Learn the direction and you do not have to be stronger than the world." He tapped the level. "You only have to be more patient." That was the lesson she remembered on the road to the North Bluff, 3 days after the county meeting, with the deed tucked under her coat, and her mother's cough breaking the silence every 100 steps. The weather had turned mean, not storm mean, worse, waiting mean. Mercy Gap sat behind them in its bowl of brown grass and stovepipe smoke. Ahead, the bluff climbed out of the flats like the exposed bone of the county. Miriam had to stop twice before they reached the cave. Liddy pretended to study the slope so her mother could pretend not to be weak. The cave mouth was wider than memory and lower than a doorway, blocked by dead cedar, thornbrush, and a drift of wind-packed leaves. Its darkness seemed too dense for afternoon. Liddy set the handcart down. Miriam stared at the opening. "I cannot sleep in there." "No," Liddy said. She did not yet know if that was a promise or a prayer. She cut the brush with her father's hatchet and stepped inside. The silence was immediate. The wind outside vanished as if a door had closed behind her. The cave ran 28 feet into the bluff before pinching into a natural crack. The floor was uneven, packed, lime dust and old stone chips. The ceiling was blackened in 2 places where some earlier fool had tried a fire and learned nothing. Cold lay in the cave like a sleeping animal, but not dead cold, moving cold. Liddy wet her finger and held it near the back crack. Air touched her skin. A faint pull, inward along the floor, then upward somewhere she could not see. The hill was breathing. She backed out slowly. That was when she saw the pipe. 46 feet from the cave mouth, Nearly buried in sage and snow, a length of blackened stovepipe rose from the ground at a slant. It was not attached to anything visible. No cabin had stood there, no fireplace, no shed. At its base the snow had withdrawn from the stone in a small dark ring. Liddy crouched and put 2 fingers against the pipe. Warm, not hot, not fresh. Warm the way a handrail is warm after someone has just gone around a corner. Someone had built part of something here, or tested part of it. Beside the pipe, scratched into a flat limestone shelf with a nail or a blade, was a mark almost filled with dirt, 1 yard. Under it, an arrow pointing toward the cave. Liddy did not understand it. Not yet. She only knew the mark belonged to a mind that measured instead of guessing. That evening she opened her father's black notebook. Jonas had not written like a man trying to be understood by strangers. He wrote like a man leaving tools for someone whose hands he trusted. There were sketches of stove chambers, notes on air inlets, lists of stone types, questions about damp lungs, and page after page about the North Bluff. Not the dead pantry. He never called it that. He called it the winter shelf. Liddy found the first diagram after midnight. A long firebox buried not inside the living space, but beneath it. A low stone channel running from the firebox under the floor, angled gently away toward a remote chimney. Hot smoke would travel the length of the channel before leaving the ground, giving most of its heat to the stone. The floor would become the stove. The room would stay clean. The fire would burn where smoke could be controlled, not where lungs had to live. Her father had written 1 line beneath the drawing. A chimney wastes heat by letting it leave standing up. Make it walk first. Liddy read that line 3 times. Then she read the next. For Miriam, air must be warm without smoke. Warm without smoke is not comfort. It is medicine. The notebook blurred in her hands. She did not cry loudly. She had learned from her mother that breath could not be wasted on drama. She only bent over the page until her forehead touched the paper. Jonas Ainsworth had not been tinkering. He had been trying to build his sick wife a place where winter could not follow, and the county had just deeded that place to the 2 people who still needed it. There are moments when a person receives an inheritance and does not recognize it, because it arrives dressed as punishment. This was one of them. By first light, Liddy had a plan. Not a good plan, a possible one. Possible was better than anything Mercy Gap had offered. They would wall the cave mouth with cedar and salvaged plank. They would dig a channel beneath the floor 30 inches deep and wide enough for flat stone lining. They would set the firebox outside the main air of the room, low and sealed, with a feed door near the entrance. The channel would run under the sleeping area and out to the pipe. If her father's calculations were right, the smoke would surrender its heat before it reached the far chimney. If he was wrong, the cave would fill with smoke. If she built it badly, the flue could crack. If the floor stayed wet, the heat would vanish into steam. If winter came early, her mother would not outlast the experiment. Possible had teeth. On the second morning at the bluff, Liddy found tools laid across the limestone shelf, a quarry pick, 2 chisels, a narrow shovel, a coil of wire, a mason's trowel worn almost smooth. No note, no name. Just tools arranged in a straight line as if the person who left them believed order was a form of respect. She picked up the pick and saw the edge. One side had been ground shorter than the other to bite into layered lime without skidding. Her father had sharpened tools that way. So had Amos Vale. She looked down toward town. No one moved on the trail. The bluff held its silence. Liddy carried the pick inside and marked the first line in the cave floor with the point of her father's level. The first foot took nearly an hour. The floor was not soil. It was old lime waste compacted by decades of water and frost, packed so hard each swing of the pick sent pain into her wrists. She worked until her palms split. She wrapped them in cloth and worked until the cloth darkened. Miriam mixed clay with ash and water whenever the cough let her stand. When standing failed, she sat with a basket in her lap and sorted stones by flatness, rejecting more than she kept. They measured progress by inches because feet were too generous. Mercy Gap measured it by gossip. By the fourth day, men at Harlan Stove were calling it Ainsworth's Burrow. By the sixth, children were daring one another to run up the trail and peek at the widow who had chosen to become an animal. By the seventh, Silas Crow came to watch. He arrived on horseback because men who want to remind you of altitude prefer to sit above you. Liddy was waist-deep in the trench, her dress stiff with lime dust, when his shadow fell across the cave mouth. What is it supposed to be? Our stove. He looked at the trench. That is a ditch. Not yet. Crow's mouth tightened at the way she said it. Not defiant, not rude, worse, unavailable. He told her about county hazard clauses, about smoke danger, about nuisance fires, about public concern, which meant private embarrassment that had gathered enough coats to look official. Liddy listened. Then she struck the trench wall with the pick, broke loose a slab of pale stone, and said, "Tell the county I am improving its gift." Crow rode down before noon. By supper, the whole town knew the Ainsworth girl was burying a stove under a cave floor because grief had loosened her mind. Frank Bell came the next morning with a wagon of planks. Frank was the best builder in 3 counties, which meant he had spent the 30 years being obeyed by wood. His joints were square. His roof shed snow. His doors hung true. He stopped at the cave mouth and took off his hat before speaking to Miriam. Then he turned to Liddy. "I can put up a lean-to against the south face. Tight wall, real hearth. You would be warmer than this hole." Liddy knew the offer cost him. Lumber did not fall from the sky. Neither did labor, she said. "Thank you, but no." Frank looked at the trench, the sorted stones, the clay trough. "You don't understand what smoke does underground. I understand what bad smoke does." His face hardened because the sentence had touched a grave. He told her about a trapping family in Sweetwater. Dugout, winter fire, no chimney worth the name. 4 bodies carried out blue-lipped by morning. He had been there. He had lifted the youngest child himself. Liddy put down the pick. She did not argue with a dead child. Instead, she walked to the little test section she had lined the night before, placed dry cedar shavings in the firebox pocket, and lit them. Smoke curled once, then it leaned, not upward, down. It slid into the stone channel with a soft inward hiss and vanished toward the buried pipe. Frank took 1 step closer. The smoke did not enter the cave. Liddy held the match until it burned close to her fingers. "Smoke is lazy only when the builder is," she said quietly. "Give it a better road and it takes the road." Frank stared at the channel. "That is not carpentry. No." "What is it?" "My father's work." That answer did not satisfy him, but it stopped him from insulting it. He left the planks. She used them for the wall he did not believe should exist. The hidden work continued. Some mornings Liddy woke and found more trench dug than she had left the night before. Never more than 3 feet, never carelessly. Always with the same slanted pick marks her father's old quarry tools would leave in lime. Amos Vale never mentioned it. He only appeared in town with more dust on his boots than a pensioned man had any reason to carry. Liddy said nothing. Some help announces itself so loudly it becomes another burden. Amos's help came like groundwater, invisible until the place it had moved. The first true failure arrived 12 days before Christmas. Liddy's pick broke through a packed layer near the far end of the channel, and water began to seep through the floor. Not a gush. Worse, a steady, patient wetness. In 1 hour it filled the low end of the trench to her ankles. The fire channel had to stay dry. Her father had written that 4 times. Whetstone drank heat and gave back damp. Damp air was exactly what Miriam's lungs could not survive. Liddy sat in the trench with the cold water around her boots and felt the plan tilt. Not break. Tilt. There is a kind of exhaustion that makes crying impossible because even grief seems to require muscles you no longer own. She opened the notebook with wet fingers and hated herself for it. The page she needed was near the back, the ink warped by some older spill. She tilted it toward the cave mouth. Late light skimmed the paper. Raised strokes appeared through the blur. Water does not care how tired you are. Then underneath it, 1 inch per yard. Let gravity do the work after you have done yours. The mark on the limestone shelf, the arrow, the pipe. Amos had not left a puzzle. He had left the missing page in the language of men who expected stone to be read. The fix was simple. That was the cruelty of it. The whole channel had to be reopened and graded from the firebox to the far chimney, 1 inch down for every yard, with a narrow side gutter cut into the lowest edge so seep water would leave before the heat arrived. 3 weeks of work had to be undone because the ground had told the truth late. Miriam saw Liddy staring at the water. For a long time she said nothing. Then she climbed down into the trench, though the cough had left her shaking, and set one hand on the wall to steady herself. "Your father used to say every honest thing costs twice," she said. Liddy laughed once. It came out broken. "Did he also say where to get a second body?" "No." Miriam lifted the shovel. "He married one. They worked until moonrise, then through the next day. Then the next." Liddy pulled up stone she had already laid, scraped away clay she had sealed with both hands, cut the grade inch by inch, and relaid every section while the cold deepened outside the cave. On the 3rd evening the water moved. Just a thread at first. Then a thin silver line along the gutter, sliding away from the channel toward the far drain. Liddy sat back on her heels. For once the world had done exactly what her father said it would. She walked outside and threw up behind a cedar bush from hunger, cold, and relief. Miriam found her there, folded a shawl around her shoulders, and did not say bravery or pride or any other word that would have made the moment smaller. She only said, "Come in, the work is still there." By December 20th, the cave mouth had a wall. Not a pretty wall, a correct one. Cedar uprights wedged into drilled sockets. Salvage planks doubled at the lower half against drift snow. Moss and clay pressed into every seam. A small window, set with glass Liddy bought by trading her mother's silver comb without permission. Miriam looked at the window after Liddy admitted what it had cost. "Your father gave me that comb. I know. Then he would be angry you traded it poorly. You should have asked for putty too." Liddy stared at her. Then both of them laughed until Miriam coughed, and even the cough sounded less like a verdict than it had in weeks. The first fire was built at dusk. Liddy used 6 cedar twigs and 2 chips of pine, no more. She wanted a test, not a funeral. The flame leaned inward, the draw took it. Smoke disappeared into the channel. The pipe outside coughed once, then gave off a thin gray ribbon so cool it vanished within a yard. Inside, nothing happened. For an hour, nothing. For 2 hours, nothing. Miriam sat wrapped in quilts, eyes open, pretending not to measure her daughter's fear. By the third hour, Liddy took off one glove. She pressed her palm to the packed floor above the channel. Cold, she moved 6 inches. Less cold. Another 6. Warmth. Not much, but real. She flattened both hands to the floor and closed her eyes. Heat was walking under the room, slow as a tired mule, steady as a vow. By midnight the cave had changed. Not hot. That was the wrong word. Hot air rises, thins, escapes, brags while it is leaving. This was not hot. This was held. The floor radiated. The lower walls softened. The bedrolls lost their damp edge. Miriam fell asleep before the fire burned down, and for the first time since autumn, she did not cough herself awake. Liddy stayed on the floor, with her cheek against the warm stone. She thought success would feel like victory. It felt like being allowed to stop holding your breath. The weather turned kind on January 7th. That was how people later described it, because people like to blame kindness when they have been fooled. By noon, snow fell from roofs in glittering sheets. Men came out in shirt sleeves. Children ran through slush. Doors opened. Blankets went to clotheslines. Mercy Gap smelled, briefly, like thawing wool and hope. Liddy stood at the bluff and disliked every inch of it. The air had gone too smooth. The sky had the polished blue of a blade. Her father had a note for this, too. Sudden mercy before deep pressure is not mercy. It is warning with manners. She spent the afternoon checking seams. Door frame, chimney draw, firebox seal, floor warmth, drain run, wood stack. Miriam watched from the table. You have checked that wall 3 times. I will stop when the wall complains. By evening the wind died completely. That was when Liddy became afraid, not while it screamed. Before, the whiteout arrived the next day at 11:40 in the morning. The first sign was not snow. It was the freight bell outside Harlan's office, ringing once by itself. Then the western ridge disappeared behind a gray wall that moved too fast for weather. A teamster crossing Main Street dropped his whip and stood staring at it. By the time he understood he should run, the wind hit Mercy Gap, sideways hard enough to tear a signboard from the Mercantile and throw it through the schoolhouse fence. The temperature fell 30 degrees before the clock reached noon. Then the snow came, not down. Across. Whiteout is a poor word for it. Whiteout sounds like something painted over the world. This was the world removed. There were no buildings, no roads, no horizon, no left or right, only impact. Wind carrying ice so fine it entered keyholes, window seams, coat collars, and the gaps between a person's thoughts. In Frank Bell's house, the great stone fireplace roared with enough flame to impress anyone not standing 10 feet away from it freezing. Frank fed it oak by the armload. The fire devoured the wood and sent most of the heat up the chimney, because that was what he had built it to do, though he had never admitted the sentence in that order. His wife Alma wrapped their feverish son in quilts near the hearth. The boy's lips had gone pale. His breath came too fast. Frank counted the wood, then counted again. The number refused to improve. At Silas Crow's Mercantile, boxes and broken crates went into the stove one after another. The store stayed cold. Silas sat in a chair behind the counter with his boots inside an empty grain sack. Coughing into a handkerchief he tried to hide from his son. Caleb Crow heard the cough and became 9 years old again. His mother had died behind that same counter in a cot pulled close to the stove. after 3 weeks of everyone saying she only needed warm air. He had offered Miriam Ainsworth a rental room because need made him feel useful, and useful was the closest thing to loved that he knew how to become. Then Liddy had refused him. Then she had built warmth out of the hill without needing him at all. And one night, drunk on humiliation, he had climbed to the bluff and kicked apart the first chimney stack with his own boots. He had felt heat through the soles before he broke it. That was the part that would not leave him. He had known it worked. He broke it anyway. Now his father coughed in the cold store, and Caleb fed another crate to a stove that could not remember heat longer than a match remembers flame. In Doc Rell's surgery, 4 people lay on the floor under coats. 1 had frostbite. 1 had a broken wrist. 1 was a girl pulled from the schoolyard after losing the line of the fence. The stove smoked because the wind outside had turned the chimney into an enemy. Doc Rell thought about the cave on the bluff. He had visited the day after Liddy's first full fire. He had stood inside, touched the floor, listened to Miriam's lungs, and said only, "Keep doing exactly this." He had not told the town. Doctors learned that facts offered too early can become arguments, and arguments waste breath. Now he wished he had wasted some. Inside the winter shelf, the storm arrived as a change in sound. The door did not rattle, the candle did not bend, the air did not move. The cave heard the blizzard the way a body hears thunder from under a quilt. Liddy fed the firebox 3 small lengths of cedar. The draw took them with its familiar low pull. Miriam sat near the table mending a sock. She had not coughed since breakfast. "It sounds wicked out there," she said. "It is. Are we safe?" Liddy listened. Not to the wind, to the floor, to the slow heat beneath her boots, to the faint water in the drain, to the fire walking under stone before surrendering its smoke. "Yes," she said. And the word surprised her by being true. The storm lasted 2 days and most of a third. Inside the cave, time became small and practical. Fire, water, sleep, soup, check the draw, clear the pipe, feed the fire. Listen to Miriam breathe. On the second night, when the wind no longer sounded angry but endless, Miriam told Liddy the part of the story she had been keeping. "Your father knew he was sick before I did." Liddy looked up from the notebook. The lime dust and the tunnel smoke. He could feel it. He said his chest was becoming a room with the windows nailed shut. Miriam's hands folded around her cup. "He brought me drawings of this place the winter before he died. I told him no woman wants to be promised a hole in the ground." A faint smile moved through the tiredness of her face. He said it was not a hole. It was a way for the hill to keep fire after his hands couldn't. The firebox ticked. "He was building this for you," Miriam said. "For me too, but mostly for you." He knew the world does not listen long to girls with empty pockets. He wanted to leave you something the world had to answer to. Liddy looked at the notebook. Every drawing changed shape in front of her. The flue was not only a flue. The drainage grade was not only a grade. The stone list, the pipe measurements, the air notes, the page that said warm without smoke is medicine. They were sentences in a language her father trusted more than speech. "I love you," written as a slope. "I will stay," written as stored heat. "I cannot stop winter," written as a machine that made winter spend itself before it reached the room. Liddy put her hand flat against the floor. The hill answered with warmth. On the morning the storm broke, Mercy Gap looked erased. Roofs rose from snow like half-remembered thoughts. Fences vanished. The freight road was gone. The sky had sharpened to a terrible blue, and the cold after the storm felt more personal than the storm itself. Frank Bell and Amos Vale reached the bluff just after noon. They had walked 2 miles through chest-deep drift, Frank breaking trail with the desperation of a father, and Amos following with the patience of a man who had once learned that underground panic gets people killed. Frank fell 3 times. The third time, he stayed on one knee too long. Amos caught his collar. "Not here," Frank tried to answer. His mouth made no useful shape. Amos pulled once. "Your boy is not in this snow. Get up." Frank got up. They saw the pipe first. The black pipe stood above the drift exactly where it had stood before, because Liddy had rebuilt it taller after Caleb Crow broke the first one. A pale ribbon rose from it, not smoke exactly, but proof that something underground was still warm enough to speak. Then they saw the window, amber light in the rock. When Liddy opened the door, warmth met them without violence. Not the blast of a room overheated in panic, a steady surrounding warmth. From the floor, from the wall, from the air that did not smell of smoke or wet wool or fear. Frank stepped inside and stopped. His beard was crusted white. His fingers had gone stiff. His eyes moved from the firebox to the floor. To the chimney line he could not see but could feel through his boots. He removed one glove and pressed his palm to the cave wall. Warm. Not near the fire. Not lucky. Warm because the room itself had been taught how to hold heat. His face changed. It did not soften. That would have been too simple. It became the face of a craftsman forced to stand inside proof that his craft, while honest, had not been the whole answer. "My boy," he said, "that was all." Liddy was already pulling wood from the stack. "Bring him." Frank looked at the pile. "I can't repay." "Bring him." Alma arrived at dusk with the boy wrapped on a sled. Miriam took over before anyone asked. Warm cloths, slow broth, dry blankets. The boy's fever broke near dawn, while Frank sat on the floor with both hands pressed to the stone like a man apologizing to a material he had underestimated. Caleb Crow came the next afternoon. He did not come with charm. The storm had stripped that off him. He stood in the doorway, face gray, eyes fixed on the floor. "My father cannot stop coughing." No one spoke. Alma Bell looked at his boots. Liddy saw her see them. The tread matched the prints left in the wet clay by the ruined chimney weeks before. Alma's eyes moved to Liddy. Liddy shook her head once. Not forgiveness, not silence, a boundary. Some debts must be paid forward before they can be spoken backward. "Take the small sled," Liddy said. "Use the south cut. The snow is lower under the cedars. I will give you wood for the return." Caleb swallowed. "Why?" Liddy looked at him for a long moment. "Because your father is not the man who broke my chimney." The words hit harder than accusation. He left before he could answer. By nightfall, he had dragged Silas Crow to the cave door with blood in both gloves and no performance left in him. He did not ask where to sit. He found a place near the wall and lowered himself to the warm floor like a man entering a church whose language he did not speak. Over the next 2 days, the winter shelf filled with people. 14 at first, then 19. Children slept in rows along the warmest section of floor. Adults sat shoulder to shoulder. Soup thinned. Privacy disappeared. Firewood became arithmetic. But the cave stayed warm, not comfortable. Survival is rarely comfortable. Warm, clean, steady. Mercy Gap had spent years laughing at the dead pantry because the cave was colder than common sense in summer. Now the town learned what Jonas Ainsworth had seen. Cold in summer meant mass. Mass meant memory. Memory meant that if you could teach stone to hold fire, the hill would not forget it when the sky turned murderous. On the 4th night, Frank Bell asked Liddy to show him the channel. She showed him the firebox door, the ash cleanout, the way the air entered low and left far away, the drain grade, the clay seals, the limestone caps, the pipe he had not believed mattered. Frank listened like a man counting his own mistakes one by one. When she finished, he said, "I know wood. Yes, I made a good house. Yes. It still nearly froze, my son." Liddy did not answer that. He nodded as if she had. "Then teach me stone." In spring, Mercy Gap changed by inches. Not because the commissioners ordered it. Not because Silas Crow apologized. He never did. Some men can hand over nails for 2 years and still not locate the word sorry. The town changed because proof had spent a winter under people's boots. Frank began building half-buried rooms into south-facing cuts. Liddy designed the underfloor channels. Amos checked the grades with a string line and a mason's eye. Doc Rell wrote down air requirements for coughs, fevers, infants, old lungs, and men who had spent too many years in dust. The first new Hearth house used 39 feet of buried flue and a 4-inch fall to the drain. The next used 52 feet because the stone bench was longer. No two were identical. That was the point. The system was not a trick copied from one cave. It was a way of reading what the ground would allow. By the second winter, 4 families had floors that stayed warm through the night on half the wood they had burned before. By the 5th, travelers approaching Mercy Gap from the freight road saw small pipes rising from hillsides and bluff cuts, each one giving off a pale thread of spent heat. People began calling them Ainsworth Hearths. Liddy hated the name at first. Then she stopped correcting it. Amos Vale died, sitting in the doorway of the winter shelf. 3 summers later, his bad leg stretched in the sun, his good hand closed around a limestone chip darkened by years in his pocket. Liddy buried him above the pipe he had helped her understand. She set his mason's trowel under the marker and scratched 1 inch per yard into the stone. No name, he would have trusted the measurement more. Miriam lived 12 winters past the winter. Mercy Gap had expected to bury her. Her cough never disappeared completely. Damage does not always leave just because conditions improve. But it became small, a weather sign instead of a sentence. She died in the warm room her husband had designed and her daughter had built, with one hand on the floor as if checking that the hill was still keeping its promise. Years later, when Liddy was no longer the girl from the cave, but the woman builders rode 30 miles to consult, a young surveyor asked to see Jonas Ainsworth's notebook. He expected crude drawings. He found careful ones. He expected superstition. He found angles, air paths, burn rates, stone notes, drainage logic, and one final page written in darker ink than the rest. The surveyor read it twice. Then he asked Liddy what it meant. She took the notebook and looked at her father's last line. Fire is a fast thing. It spends itself trying to escape. Stone is a patient thing. It keeps what it is given and returns it when the world goes cold. Be stone for the people you love. Outside, winter had started again. Snow moved across Mercy Gap in thin white sheets. The hills held their buried warmth. Small pipes stood above the drifts. Floors remembered fires that had gone out hours ago. And in the north bluff, behind a cedar door, set into pale limestone, a lamp glowed steady in the old, dead pantry, not because the cave had defeated winter, because a dead man had taught his daughter how to make winter pay rent before it came inside. The fire had spent itself. The mountain kept its promise.